My name is Gabriel Valdivia. I've been working as a product designer at Facebook for the last 4 years. 2 of those years I've been working on a team called Social VR, which is focused around understanding what virtual reality means and what it can bring to the table when it comes to social interactions. So today, I'd like to talk to you about some of the lessons that we learned in the past couple of years. Hopefully we can learn them together. With the past 10 years, really, I've been designing digital and physical products, and I've always been attracted to kind of the novelty of change. Let's see. So like many of you, I started my career as a graphic designer. I dealt in picas, I carried Pantone books, and I measured twice and cut once. Then the web came along, and it threatened to kill print. So I had to become acquainted with HTML, CSS, and I guess CSS grids now. We're still keeping up with the trends. These websites quickly demanded more interaction from us, like Flash entered the scene and really conquered our hearts. So we all turned our attention to animation and prototyping to convey user flows in a way that was more interactive. Then the iPhone showed up and forced us to think smaller. We got excited about skeuomorphism. We learned a lot about pixel density, and we made a vow to design mobile first. So after a while, we tried to combine all of the above into a holistic practice that would buy us a seat at the table, where we can think not just about aesthetics and interactions and user needs, but also business needs, and validating them through user research. So over the last 10 years, we've seen content move from newsstands to desks to our laps, and then onto our hands. This reminds me of Frank's talk, where he mentioned that 20 years of experience can feel like 5 years 4 times over. So one question I have is, how do we deal with so much change? So for me, what helps is keeping a beginner's mind. And a beginner's mind is a term used in Zen Buddhism that refers to having an attitude of openness, of preconceptions when studying a subject, even when studying at an advanced level. So it seems clear to me that the next step is to remove the device altogether and place it within the content itself, removing the abstraction between you and the content. So we call this immersive design. And immersive design includes VR, AR, MR, basically all the Rs. So we're seeing this realized today in phones through AR. However, it has 2 major limitations. 1, the field of view, and 2 is the input. So because these experiences are still restricted to a rectangle in your hands, they can only really aspire to be a window into another world, not quite inhabiting your own world yet. This also limits the way we interact with AR experiences. So we've developed a language for using our face as an input mechanic. We choreograph facial gestures, like opening our mouth or raising our eyebrows to control AR masks, while other experiences rely on the now kind of antique tapping interaction. So these experiences, I think, leave a lot to be desired and drastically limit what we can design for them. So I think this is where VR comes in. I think that VR is the best way to explore immersive design because it can address some of the challenges that are present in AR today while taking advantage of a more immersive field of view and natural gesture interactions. So there are challenges like thinking in 3D, weaving volumetric UI into the world that reacts to the environment and the people in it, while also solving people problems. So it's not a perfect simulation, but it opens a bunch of questions of what immersive design can be and how people will interact with technology in the future. So let's talk about VR itself. It's 2017, and virtual reality has arrived, right? It's not quite the Matrix yet, but high-quality VR experiences are available to the masses, and virtual reality has already proven to be a powerful entertainment platform, especially when it comes to videos and immersive cinema. But VR has also found a niche within professionals. It really shines whenever we're using 2D tools to create 3D objects. Architects, 3D modelers, and industrial designers can really greatly benefit from directly manipulating volumetric objects and removing 2D abstractions of X, Y, and Z coordinates without the limitations of physics can really feel like a creative superpower. We're seeing some really great work being done in this area. We're also seeing brands like Audi use virtual reality to let their users customize their cars and have them walk through those changes in real time without really having to have an actual car there. The Stanford Virtual Heart uses the power of three-dimensional storytelling to simulate surgery and allowed med students to make mistakes and try again as they explore the intricacies of the human heart. This is an unprecedented luxury because med students typically only have access to animal hearts for practice. But with VR, they can explore it in new ways and save thousands of lives. So one of my favorite ones, the Walk Again project, is working with scientists to find a way to make paraplegics move again. So here's what they did. They took 8 patients paralyzed from the waist down by spinal cord injuries. Then twice a week, for an hour a day, they put patients to a VR experience. So they used their brain waves to control a virtual avatar of themselves walking. Then by monitoring their brain waves, researchers found out how to trick patients' brains into actually feeling like they're walking. Then they were put into a robot with legs, like an actual robot, that they could physically move with those brain waves. So for the first 12 months, they relied on that exoskeleton to walk, but after a while, they started being able to voluntarily move their own muscles. So scientists think that virtual walking helped restart communication between surviving nerves and the muscle receptors in their legs. So it's actually making people walk again. It's pretty incredible. So at Facebook, we're especially excited about the potential of VR to connect people around the world in a more meaningful way. That is connecting them to each other and to the memories we share. So first, we introduced 360 videos and photos to the feed early last year. And although this may seem super groundbreaking, especially compared to people walking again, it was a big step in democratizing VR content creation by introducing panoramic photos as an immersive content. So at the time, VR creation was limited to people with really expensive gear. And all of a sudden, anyone with a camera phone could upload a panorama and consume them in VR. So that means that everyone became a VR creator overnight. And they could share their creations with the world, with the people that they care about. So this is really huge when sharing memories, if you think about it. So imagine a big event like your wedding, then capturing that in VR. Then years later, letting your grandkids walk through your wedding and feel like they were there. That's the power of immersive storytelling, especially when it's experienced by your friends and family. So after working on that, we set out to design Facebook's first VR app, which we called Facebook 360. So we found that all these people were creating 360 content on the feed, but it would often get lost between all other types of content. So we designed a home to find and consume all your friends' 360 content and videos on Facebook. Most recently, we worked on an app called Facebook Spaces, which is Facebook's first step into social VR. And the app is largely an experimental playground where we explore how to convey identity in a virtual world to break geographical barriers and enable same-room social interactions between 2 or more people that may be miles away. Okay, so the question is, how do you design for virtual reality, right? So to answer that question, this is the part where you guys wake up. We need some help from the audience. So raise your hand if you've ever tried VR before. All right, that's a lot. Okay, so keep your hand up if you own a VR headset. Okay, not as many. Keep your hand up if you've ever spent more than 5 consecutive hours in VR. So, yeah. We have okay. What if you spent 5 hours in VR this week? Okay, no hands are up. So we're in the room full of designers and developers attending a talk about VR. And even between us, we're having a hard time finding consistent usage. Like, we're all nerds, so we should be all doing this, right? And for context, the average person spends 20 hours a week on their smartphone. And it took about 8 years for smartphones to reach 65% saturation in the US alone. So, it will be a slow process. We have a long way before VR is the next computing platform. The technology has yet to find product market fit. It's cumbersome to use and requires a lot of equipment. And in spite of its success in a few niches, VR still needs to find its killer app and context of use. So the jury's still out whether this belongs in your living room or maybe a gallery experience that you visit, like you do an art museum. If you think about it, it took film quite a bit of time to arrive at the standard 90-minute duration, which is about as long as it takes your bladder to digest 1 liter of Coke at the cinema. So as a design community, we're still exploring what works and what doesn't, and we're still far from really having all the answers. So I'm happy to share some of the things we've learned so far. Keep in mind that we're still in the early days, and what seems to work today might not necessarily work in the future. Okay, so as a designer, we're often told to get out of the way. That's something we hear often, at least I do. We're told to be content first and make room for the reason people use your product in the first place, right? However, VR poses an interesting question, which is, what is content? Or what is content in VR? And where does the line between content and UI start and end? So if we model virtual reality on our actual reality, then we can look at real-world examples for this. For example, the savannah, the oldest interaction models. We can see everything. Content obeys the space. Objects in the present are close at hand. The future is in the horizon before us, and the past is behind. The shop, just like the savannah, implies a space that you can move around in, but with a higher level of density. Content can be locked to the walls or places inside of a space. So both of these were designed by either nature or a store clerk. But in VR, the designer can be nature, store clerk, the architect, the weather, and everything that defines the rules of the space. So this can be a lot to take in for a single role. So designers end up doing what we do best, which is connecting dots. So for us, that means working with many specialists to define, conceptualize, and execute an experience. So that means collaborating with experts in 3D modeling, sound design, prototyping, engineering, to quickly explore ideas, then take them through user research to validate them, rinse, and repeat. So what's the actual deliverable, right? Like, what are you actually building? And for designers, that really depends on the person. It's whatever you need to get your point across. So nowadays, we spend a lot of time working in Unity and in low fidelity. So we've all bought iPad Pros and a pencil, and we've been sketching again, like real sketching, not the tool sketch. So we're drawing storyboards for a particular interaction, then jumping into Unity to quickly prototype it. And by prototype it, I mean we're Googling stuff that sounds impossible at first. Then we're diving into really obscure forums and engaging with a small community of VR creators. And yet again, wrestling with tools that were designed for a different purpose and adapting them to our workflow. But in that process, we found 3 new concepts that I think are super interesting, and I'd like to share them with you today. Those are presence, agency, and comfort. These are words that I never actually considered very much before joining VR, but are now the main focus of my work. So let's start with the first one, presence. Presence is like the most overused buzzword in VR today. It's like the bread and butter of VR. It's the feeling that you're there physically present in a non-physical world. So what your eyes are seeing, what your ears are hearing, everything is telling you what's around is real, so you believe it is. That's presence. So avatars are a key component of presence. With VR, the classic rules of a video game avatar are no longer available. Instead of the avatar being a representation of you that you control from a distance with a third-person point of view, in VR, you are the avatar. You're in your avatar skin. So it's incredibly important to make you feel comfortable in your own avatar. So avatars can attempt to be a direct representation of your identity. They can decorate your identity in ways that are not possible in the real world. Or you can ignore your identity and completely inhabit new personas. So we're just scratching the surface of how we can let yourself express yourself in VR. But right now, the opportunities are really exciting. We've landed at a cartoon representation of yourself. And these work really well within today's constraints of VR. They're charming, inviting, and forgiving. Keep in mind, one of the big considerations of the app is to invite people who are not necessarily gamers and who think of VR as orcs and space, and make it more approachable for everyone. But there's really a lot that's going on into making your avatar as expressive as your actual real-life person. For example, we quickly learned that it was very important to make your eyes feel alive. Having an avatar give you a dead stare really doesn't feel very right. So we found that adding fake blinking combined with a subtle movement of the pupil and some eyebrow movements made the eyes and the face feel real and alive. Another interesting aspect is eye gaze. Since the VR headsets today aren't capable of tracking your eyes, we created an algorithm that predicts what the person might be paying attention to. We found that when you're in the middle of a conversation, having an avatar making eye contact can be really powerful. And it really makes you feel present in the space with that person. We've also learned a lot that when someone is speaking, indicating on the avatar's face, it was very important. So we found that it helps with making the avatar believable, but it also helps recognizing who's speaking when in a group conversation. So finally, we learned how important hands can be in social interaction. We even found in research that people could recognize their significant other from other people simply through their hand gestures. So even if today's VR systems can only track your hands and the head, we were able to simulate a torso and arms, which gives the avatar next to you better presence in the space and makes you feel like they're standing next to you. So that's presence. It's the holy grail of VR experiences, and we have a lot of work to do to make this feel really right. That's kind of our first step so far. Next up, we have agency. So what makes VR different from any other traditional medium is the amount of agency it can give to people. The user is literally at the center of the experience and can freely decide where to look, what to touch or grab, etc. And when it comes to agency, like input is king. And this is really an important point I want to emphasize on VR. We've been operating under the assumption that people can tap, long press, swipe, and pinch screens in their hands. But this gets quite a bit more complicated in VR, where the interaction paradigms can vary depending on the headset you use. So unlike other VR purists, at Facebook, we see VR as a spectrum. And as you can see, input richness varies heavily depending on the platform. So on one side, you have VR and 360 experiences on mobile devices, like 360 photos and videos on your Facebook app. We think that's VR too. And on the other side of the spectrum, we have more immersive experiences, which come with higher fidelity of input, but also a higher price tag. So depending on the platform you're targeting, the input controllers will vary. And the interactions you'll design and the agency you'll give to people will end up being quite different. So for in-headset experiences, there are basically 3 types of input: gaze, 3-DoF, and 6-DoF. That may not mean anything to you, but it's something we talk about a lot. And DOF stands for degrees of freedom. So gaze is what puts people at the center of the experience. It plays a very important role in making people feel immersed. It can also be leveraged as a way to manipulate user interfaces and make selections. And at that point, that's very similar to the web. There's typically a pointer, but instead of controlling it with your mouse, you control it with your head, and the UI reacts as you hover and click it. And while this is pretty intuitive, a gaze-based interaction can be quite tiresome for people, as they're not used to constantly moving their head to navigate UI. So it's important to design experiences that use it in moderation. The next step up from that is the 3DoF controller. And again, DoF stands for degrees of freedom. So that means that the controller can swivel left to right, it can tilt forward and backwards, and it can pivot side to side. In addition to that, the controller also includes a trigger button and a trackpad that supports swipe gestures, like the ones that you can see right here. So as you can see, your options, or your toolkit as a designer, kind of greatly expands when you have more options. And then the step, even after that, is 6DoF. So these controllers can move left, right, up, down, forward, and backwards, in addition to doing everything that 3DoF controller can. Some controllers even include sensors that can detect different hand poses, which opens up a lot of possibilities. So things get pretty interesting once people start having hands in VR. Suddenly, people want to be able to touch and grab things, but it's also a source of challenges when it comes to designing user interfaces. You have to think about what hands should look like, how they should feel, and what should happen to hands when the user interacts with the UI. Do you have virtual buttons? Do you just touch it, or do you have to push it like you would in the real world? You kind of have to come up with all those rules for each app. So with Spaces, the way we design agency is by embracing skeuomorphism again, and giving people a small set of tools and things that look and behave like they do in real life. Our marker looks like a marker and behaves like a marker, so people know immediately how to draw. And then when people encounter something extra magical, like this hand-drawn flower here, once you draw it, it becomes a real object. And as you can see, you can then grab it and do different things with it. You can put it in your head, and so on. So let's watch as Christoph does this. There you go. So one huge challenge when designing for social VR experiences is that not a lot of people in VR, there's not a lot of people in VR yet. So when you do have VR, it can quickly feel lonely, and you feel like you wish you could show your friends how it is and connect with them. So that became something pretty obvious to us early on, and one of the most interesting problems for us to solve. How do you design an experience that is really asymmetric? There's a few people that have access to the technology, and most people don't. So we created a feature in which you can video call any of your friends using Messenger. This means that your friend can see anything you're doing in VR, and you're seeing their video feed. We also allow you to go live from VR, so all your friends can be with you and see what you're up to. And because we really want VR to be an experience that's engaging, we want to also give agency to the people watching on their phones. So when people comment, their comments appear as real objects, so you can grab them, show them to the camera, decorate them, etc. But this is just one example of how we can give agency into the virtual world to people who don't have VR yet, and let them partake into the experience. So we made a short video that explains what I just talked about when we launched live on Facebook from within VR.
Hi, what can I do for you today?
Hi, Professor Ochoa. I could really use some help with this week's assignment. I can't get my compiler to work.
Let's take a look and see what you've been working on this week.
This is the one I've been working on.
Do you remember this slide from our class? So this will be directly applied to this section right here where you guys did the sequencing.
That's awesome. I think I get it now. It makes a lot more sense.
Great. It looks like we have a comment from Wayne. Does anyone have any questions about this particular assignment?
So like I said, not quite the Matrix, but we're getting there. So yeah, that's just an example of how we can leverage Facebook as a distribution platform and connect people outside of VR into VR, and then provide value to those who choose to be early adopters for the technology. So that was agency. The last one is comfort. This is the geekiest one, so hopefully you're awake by now, but this will get a little dense. But one of the great things about VR is that it evokes visual reactions from people. This is what allows people to connect so strongly with VR experiences, really. However, this means that having bad experiences can generate kind of a fight or flight reaction from people that would make them unlikely to experience your app or even VR ever again. So this is why it's very important that we ensure a comfortable experience when designing for VR. And comfortable means comfortable in all levels: ergonomic, optical, psychological, sociological. Like, people should feel like they're in control of the experience. But one of the most common discomfort complaints of VR relates to motion sickness. And it turns out, in the past couple of years, we've learned a lot about this. So that alien-looking thing is called the vestibular system. And it's the organ within our inner ear that provides awareness of body, balance, and movement. So believe it or not, you all have that inside your ear. And usually our vestibular system works in tandem with our vision to orient a person in real life. But in VR, your vision may see you're running up a bridge, whereas your vestibular system is saying you're not moving at all. So this type of physical and mental conflict can cause discomfort as a result. So what do you do in cases like this? Clearly, being able to roam around or fly in a spaceship in an environment is part of the magic of VR. So how do you design for motion in VR given these constraints? Well, there are different techniques like teleportation that have been developed to interpret movement instead of walking in linear motion. Teleportation has been shown to mitigate locomotion discomfort by a considerable amount. And it's already used in several games like Robo Recall here. We actually use a version of teleportation for spaces as well, where the environment activates while the user stays stationary. So why is this type of motion okay? Like, why doesn't it make us feel uncomfortable like other types of motion do? Well, to answer that question, it's important to really understand how our brain interprets motion and trajectory. In the example above, our eyes perceive dots moving counterclockwise, although nothing is actually moving. That's called the phi phenomenon, which is an optical illusion of perceiving continuous movement when there is actually no movement at all. So teleportation essentially uses this illusion by simply making you think that these two states are related, even though they're technically not. Your brain is missing all the information of trajectory and motion, like inertia, velocity, and speed, in between these 2 points. And in turn, this mitigates motion sickness, even though you feel like you're actually moving. So what about experiences that actually do have continuous motion? Like, does this mean that VR is incapable of providing such experiences? Well, of course not. However, your brain will need a bit of a helping hand doing so. The second term is called optic flow, which is really just a fancy way of saying we need enough information to make us believe that we're moving relative to space. So managing optic flow is crucial in creating a comfortable experience that deals with continuous motion. The trick here is to make the user feel as stationary as possible by conveying that it's not them who's moving, but the objects or environment around them. This is why managing optic flow with fixed points of reference are vital. That's a chimpanzee, by the way. So to create these foundations, we just need to provide enough information to our brains in order to convince it that we are actually stationary. So in this first example, it's really difficult to tell who's moving in relation to each other. Having an ambiguous background while still exerting lots of motion will cause the user to interpret it as self-motion. However, as we add a background, floor, and other fixed elements, it suddenly becomes clear that it's only the object that's moving. These are the types of encouragements that we as designers can construct to let our users experience the world in specific ways. So, okay, so that's great, but what about the spaceship I showed earlier, right? Like, how do you you're literally in space. Like, how do you encourage being stationary there? So you're seeing this technique develop in many VR experiences, and it's actually a really good example of how we interpret our surroundings. So in this example, the cockpit itself lessens the intensity of the user's optic flow by acting as our fixed point of reference to the motion the person feels outside of the spaceship. So the cage-like container provides an illusion of feeling stationary relative to the cockpit. So in a sense, you're not really moving. It's space that's moving around you and your spaceship. So there you go, that's comfort. And in immersive design, we're dealing with people's anatomy to design experiences that are comfortable. So respecting a person's vestibular system through techniques like the phi phenomenon and managing optic flow are just a few ways we design around tricky challenges like movement and motion sickness. These are just three of our learnings that we've had so far. Along with this, we have many other learnings, and we actually created a website where we're documenting all of those. So if you'd like to learn more about designing for VR, you can visit that, and you see some of our writing and a few resources to get started yourself, and start exploring that with us. But yeah, that is us, and thank you.